Our next talk focuses on Agile and some related tools in GitHub. So when people refer to Agile, I hear a lot of different things. So probably 10 or 12 years ago, this idea of Agile started to come around Sandia where I work. And people who were not doing really formal requirements and design and documentation, they would just say, yeah, my project's Agile. You don't have a test suite. Yeah, we just kind of do it Agile. Is there documentation? No, we're more of an Agile development team. Well, unfortunately, this didn't bode well with a lot of management and sponsor types. And so Agile got kind of a bad rap for a while. And I would say it took probably 6 or 7 years to really filter out to where people don't use Agile as some kind of excuse. Lately, Scrum has been a really popular Agile framework. But Agile is not Scrum. And I'll talk about this more in depth as the talk goes on, but starting with Scrum, especially in the field that we're in, can really lead to a lot of problems. It can lead to people thinking that certain processes and practices are a waste because Scrum is heavier weight than some other methodologies. Now, I am a certified Scrum Master, and I do like Scrum in some cases. And I teach an undergraduate software engineering class sometimes where I teach Scrum, and we go through some sprints. And I think Scrum is great, but not as much at work. Not in the field that we're in. So what really is Agile then? I think the best way to define it is to go back to the original Agile Manifesto. We are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. Through this work, we have come to value individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. Now, I think one of the reasons why Agile got off to a bad rap in at least the community that I live in is because people ignored the fine print at the bottom. That is, while there is value in the items on the right, we value the items on the left more. So having a plan is still valuable. It's just that you need to be agile in your response to the changes that you see. Comprehensive documentation is still valuable, but it's not as valuable if your software doesn't work. So behind Agile are 12 core principles, and I want to call out some of the highlights. The first one I consider to be incredibly important: satisfying the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. The alternative here that I've seen way too many times is that a team tries to convey requirements to another team. That team goes off for a week or a month or 3 months or 6 months and comes back with working software that doesn't meet the actual requirements, because we're not necessarily that good in a lot of cases at really getting to the heart of requirements. So I know you didn't have a lot of questions for Jared, but you really should pay a lot of attention to requirements. And so now they come to you with this software that doesn't do exactly what you want it to do. Agile would say, deliver quickly small chunks of functionality. Have a lot of conversations with your customer along the way, and so that your course corrections are just very minimal. Whereas when somebody comes back with a working piece of software that doesn't meet the requirements, you basically have 3 choices. You can take something that doesn't meet your full requirements and just kind of make it work, because maybe it's close enough, maybe it's not as efficient, maybe it doesn't cover exactly the right thing, but you can use it. You can have them start over. You can tell them, nope, try again. And they throw out everything that they did and start over. Or you can have them modify what they've done. Once you get to the point that you have developed a lot of the functionality of a piece of software, it can be really hard to change it. And this is where we start to see even some software that has a really good design to start, over time, the design atrophies and gets ugly because people quickly hack something onto it. We heard about that some this morning where you're doing a really good job, but then things get busy and you break it. So you end up with one of these three choices, whereas ideally, maybe you'd be able to come with an earlier prototype. And maybe the prototype doesn't really work, but it shows them what the interface would look like, or it would show them what features would be available. One example from a different field is we started working with a contractor who was helping us with some websites, and they would deliver some early wireframes of these websites. And they wouldn't work at all, they'd just be kind of sketches. But it would show you what features were there. Maybe you could start to write the documentation, write a little bit lower level requirements from Jared's talk again. We welcome changing requirements. That's really scary because you start working on things and maybe you did know. You knew at the beginning exactly what they were asking for and you delivered it to them and they say, yeah, we don't need that anymore, we need this. And so again, the frequent communication and the smaller course corrections here. Anshu actually referenced this, I believe, too this morning, where you can think about how requirements might change in the future. Maybe you can design your code in such a way that you don't have to rewrite the entire guts when you start to use Cocos or Raja. And so you can think ahead to how requirements might change. All right, agile processes promote sustainable development where you can maintain a constant pace indefinitely. So this is what Catherine talked about this morning with the heroic efforts. We don't want these. We don't want heroic efforts. Because if people are doing things heroically, you're building up technical debt, as we talked about. People get burned out badly. And then who wants to go and clean up the mess when somebody's screaming for something else? And so what you ideally want to do is work a reasonable work schedule fairly regularly and have heroic feats occur as seldom as you reasonably can. That doesn't mean you're going to always be able to do everything cleanly. There was the example this morning of the week and a half allocation that you had a very short period of time to prepare for. Those things happen, but there are cases where you can prepare. Simplicity, the art of maximizing the work not done. So I really like not doing work. And I stress this to the team one of the teams that I lead. When we're talking about, well, could we re-implement this? Could we do this with this tool? And I always want to try to reuse something that already exists. Is there something that meets 95% of my requirements? We could put a really thin layer on top of it, do something simpler. Jared talked about kind of the minimal design practices associated with TDD this morning, that you don't want to over-design right away. You want to build up that design during refactor steps. And that's what this principle speaks to, because it ends up being, in a lot of cases, something that you don't necessarily need. Layers and layers and layers of abstractions that just get to be too much sometimes. All right, and then I think maybe the most important principle in some ways is taking a step back and reflecting as a team how you can be more effective from time to time. Not in the heat of somebody's heroic effort necessarily, but take a step back, and we'll talk about when is a good time to do that coming up here. So when tailored correctly, Agile practices can really be useful to a lot of research teams and scientific software development teams. A lot of the traditional, really heavy-handed approaches to software development don't take into account a lot of the unknown factors associated with the research community and unknown architectures and things of that nature. So even with Scrum, I consider that maybe still a little bit too heavy-handed for a lot of the development teams in our community, because Scrum has very rigid, paced out sprints, they're called, where at the end of each sprint you deliver working software, and there's very specific requirements for each. As many of you know, you're not necessarily going to come to some research finding by next Wednesday, or in this case, Tuesday, I guess. You can't plan things like that. So you need something a little bit more flexible than that. And at a higher level, one of the issues I see with Scrum teams is they'll say, hey, this Scrum, this is great. It's supposed to improve your productivity by 10x, and there's all these wonderful things. And so a team will start to do it, and right away they'll say, well, you know what though? We should have longer sprints because we don't know how long it might take to reach this, so let's make our sprints 2 months instead of 3 weeks. One of the things that you'll find very quickly with Scrum is that it works by far the best if you have fully dedicated team members, where you're not splintered on a bunch of projects. I don't know if that's your reality. That's very much not my reality, that you're 100% dedicated to one project. And so, again, Scrum is right for certain situations, but the point here is that if you take Scrum and you start pulling pieces out of it, you experience a phenomenon called Scrum butt. We do Scrum, but we don't have a dedicated team. We do Scrum, but we don't really do our planning meetings like that because, well, this 10x improvement quickly comes down to like a 0.5x if you start doing Scrum butt. And so what I propose in a lot of these cases, I guess I should go back for just a second and say Scrum is good in situations where your requirements are a little bit better known, where you're maybe not trying to do something novel. That's just my own opinion, where you really can pace things out and say, here's this much work and we can get this done. And there are cases like that. That's just not the cases I'm speaking to today. Kanban, on the other hand, is a more minimalistic framework that you can build up instead of tearing down from Scrum. And so I'm going to introduce Kanban and then talk about ways to augment it. So there's really one really important principle behind Kanban. How many of you have heard of Kanban? Okay, how many have used it? Okay, all right. So most of you haven't. Okay, so the guiding principle of Kanban is to limit the number of in-progress tasks. And this sounds really, really simple, but it's really important because my experience, and I've done it again and again and again, despite knowing things about Kanban, is that you start working on something, somebody screams for something else, you go and you work on that, and somebody screams for something else, and you go and work on that, and then when that's done, you pick up the new thing, you don't go back to what you were doing before, and now you have all this in-progress stuff that you haven't had any value delivered from. Now, ideally, you've incrementally delivered some of the value there, and you could consider that part to be done, and the rest may be lower priority. But otherwise, you start to have all this in-progress stuff. Did you have a question? Okay. So the question then is, how much in progress is too much? And so with a larger team, a common convention is 2n-1 tasks at any given time. The rationale here is that you often get stuck on something, or you're waiting for something from someone else. Okay, so you work on something else. Okay, well, who's this poor sucker who only gets the 1 then, right, for your team? So you got the 2n minus 1. What are they supposed to do when they're stuck? Well, they can't pull another task, so they need to help someone else get unstuck. They need to communicate with people. They need to, and that 1 isn't always the same person, right? But it's kind of a teamwork thing to help people get unstuck and keep things moving. And you can see as time goes on, when you have some list of tasks, and we'll look at how this works a little later, but if the same in-progress tasks are in progress for 9 months, that's a good warning flag for you. You don't have a deadline for getting those done, but if everything's stuck that long, that's definitely a warning flag. Okay, so basic Kanban. The most basic Kanban board has 3 tasks, or 3 columns, I'm sorry. A backlog, an in progress, and a done. And so anything in the backlog is just anything. Somebody can come up with an idea and throw it in the backlog. We added in this example a ready column because what often happens there is a project leader will say, okay, well, here's the things in the backlog. Okay, this is ready to be worked. We haven't started it yet, but we have enough information about this task. It's well enough defined that someone can start working on it. That's what ready is. In progress, I think is fairly self-explanatory. That's the things that people are working on, hopefully. But as I said, if you are anything like me, I have lots of things that are in progress that aren't realistically making any progress. And then done. Okay, so that was a little bit of a high-level team overview of Kanban. I want to note here that you can also use Kanban just in your personal life. And I've done this sometimes, where you have a board of things that you want to get done at home or for school or for whatever not else. And you can use a similar setup. And it's nice because it's a lightweight way to keep track of things. A very practical example here is if you have this backlog, to do, ready, in progress, and done column, and your spouse calls you during the day and says you need to fix XYZ at home, instead of feeling stress about that all day long, you just put that in the ready to work column and you get that done as quickly as you possibly can. But you don't have to sit and think about it because you know that when you revisit your Kanban board, it'll be there. Similar to a Scrum approach, for those of you who are familiar with Scrum, you can just use a whiteboard for this Kanban board, much like a Scrum board. There's also software out there. I use Trello. It's available for Android, iOS, whatever, through a web browser, and that'll carry your Kanban boards around with you. Keep in mind, though, if you start to use any of these things for work, that a lot of these things are web interfaces, and if you have sensitive information, just be smart. Okay. All right. There's also other tools. Jira. Have you used Jira? Who's used Jira? Okay, not very many. Okay, so that's a tool from a company called Atlassian, the company that supports Bitbucket. And that's a fairly sophisticated tool that you can implement some customized and agile workflows within. And then I assume most of you have used GitHub and potentially the issues associated with that. Okay, so then for your own personal Kanban, how many tasks do you want in progress at a time? 2n minus 1, where n equals 1, isn't necessarily a good option. So start with 2 or 3 and go from there. For your team approaches as well, 2n minus 1 isn't the answer. It's a starting point. You have to feel it out. Your team may be very highly dependent on another team who's setting up systems for you or who's doing this or that, and you may get legitimately stuck and you may want to increase that. The problem gets to be if you increase and you say 10n minus 1, you're no longer realistically limiting your work in progress, and you're losing a lot of the value. So 2 things I want to call out on this list is when you have a Kanban board, if you have 10 minutes left at the end of your day, you can often pick out a task and use that time efficiently. If you have a little bit of downtime while you're waiting for a response from someone, as long as you keep some flexibility in how many tasks you have in progress, you can use those downtimes effectively. Everyone who I've ever known who's used Kanban has fallen off the bandwagon many times because you're really honed in and you're doing this and you're chugging along really nice, and then something blows up and everyone has to drop everything and fix something or do something. You have to use some discretion as to when to just say forget it and just fix something. But when the cost of not fixing something outweighs the productivity losses of dropping everything for a while, then you just have to be smart about that. So the in progress column is really important, especially for people who are more junior in their communities. So somebody comes around and says, hey, can you do this for me? Yeah, absolutely. Which one of these do you want me to stop doing? Because I'm already doing these 4 things right now. Oh, no, those are all really important. I'll ask somebody else. Okay, that works. If your supervisor comes around and they say, can you do this for me? Yeah, which one of these do you want me to drop? If they say that one and that one, then you have a pretty clear answer too. But at least you're very explicit about what you're working on. The more senior members in your group can support you. If a customer comes and says, hey, why haven't you delivered on this? Well, it's because we retasked them on this. Okay, so building on Kanban. I mentioned before, I think there's 43 or something, components to what, constitutes Scrum. I don't know what they are. I had heard that number. And there's like 7 basic components of Kanban. And so what often happens if a team adopts Scrum and then falls into Scrum Butt is that they say, well, this doesn't seem to be delivering value for me. This doesn't seem to be improving our productivity. We don't really have time for this. No one comes to this meeting anymore. And so they just kind of start arbitrarily pulling out pieces that they think aren't helping them. But that really hurts the cohesiveness of Scrum and how it's meant to improve productivity. So when you are starting with Kanban and you want to start to add some Agile practices to your Kanban practices, don't think, oh, they have a meeting every morning. We should probably do that because that looks good. Don't do that. Figure out what's a problem for you. Figure out what you're struggling with. I mentioned one of the Agile principles that I like the most is periodically reflect on what's going wrong. If you've got something going wrong, look at what that is and see if there's a practice that can help you with that. For example, maybe you end up, so I had a project team with a class, and at the end of the first sprint, they came back and they had all implemented their pieces for the first sprint, and they were ready to deliver software, and they all went to check it in, and the designs were completely different. None of it was compatible. And this was like the night before. This is the typical undergraduate experience, right? Complete mess, 10:30 at night, nothing worked together. Okay. So you need to be more communicative about that. Well, what's one way you could do that? Well, maybe we want to add a daily stand-up. So a stand-up is a meeting that originated with Scrum, but I've used it with groups that practice Kanban. And basically, the idea behind a stand-up is that everyone stands up during that meeting. That's supposed to keep it short because we're more comfortable sitting than standing. But everyone goes around the group and says, since our last stand-up, I did this. Prior to our next stand-up, my goals are to do this. And I've been getting stuck with this. So what did I do? What am I going to do? And what am I stuck on? What problems am I experiencing? And you go around and you do that. And the stand-up isn't supposed to take more than 15 minutes. And there's a lot of value in that, though, because you're communicating regularly what you're working on. Somebody might say, I plan to do this before next meeting. And you say, oh, good, then I don't have to do that. I'm glad they went first. And so if there are larger issues to discuss, this is a little bit more detailed. You can look into stand-ups, but you can anyone can call parking lot. And then that discussion is filtered to the end of the meeting, and then only those who are associated with different stand-ups need to stick around, and everyone else can get back to work. You might find that a lot of things are blocked, and you might find that your 2n minus 1 has 1.5 n that are all blocked because of different organizations or different policies. Maybe you want, even in your Kanban, to have a Scrum Master, someone whose primary purpose for the team is to remove impediments and keep things moving quickly. Be a little bit of a modified Scrum Master role, but you may want to dedicate resources to that, because sometimes those problems only go away when someone really dedicates time to that. You might have problems with people not implementing exactly the right code, like I mentioned before, where the requirements aren't quite right. Maybe you got some high-level requirements and you started to break those high-level requirements into low-level requirements, but there wasn't enough communication there. Okay, so maybe that means we need to go with an epic story task. Have people heard of epic story task? No, okay. So I get a little bit of a detail here. So when Jared talked about high-level requirements, you might get a high-level requirement that says, I need to provide a solver for X, whatever that is. And that might be a really large task. And then within that, you would start to break down stories. These are a little different than user stories. But basically, it's a more manageable amount of work than an epic. And then once you get down to the task level, these are very well defined with a clear definition of done. And you can look into why. Okay, so definition of done is valuable because it is very clear criteria for when something is done and not. And this is incredibly useful because what I often end up seeing is that teams don't have a definition of done. And they have some task in front of them. And they figure, well, it'll probably take 2 weeks, maybe 2 weeks. Well, a week and a half in, they might actually, by some miracle, have something that meets all those requirements. But they keep working because they start to do more stuff. They fill all the time that they have. With a definition of done, you can be very clear about what to do and also what not to do. And so each task, each story even should have a definition of done, and then you break that down into individual tasks, the sum of which will complete that story. And those tasks should be very clear and well defined. But with this epic story task model, you can do what Jared talked about. You can start with some high-level requirements. And he talked too about getting down into the details too quickly or having the wrong people get down into the details. You can write things down and put it to the side, and then before you start working that story, the rule is just you have to know what done looks like. And before you know what done looks like very specifically, you don't start it. So that's when you refine those details. I wouldn't go to the low-level requirement area sooner than you have to, because very often requirements change. And this is one way that you can capture what you're thinking about a requirement, look at what you have at the high level, and then only delve into those details when it's timely to do so. because it may not be something that ever gets done, depending on prioritization in the future. Okay, I'm going to skip over that. All right. So there were lots of different ways to build some agile practices onto Kanban. And so again, I would look at what's going wrong with my team, what practice can I add? Okay, so here's another example. There's a Better Scientific Software GitHub repo called A-Team Tools, Agile Team Tools, for primarily focused at small teams. And this has a few examples of how to add agile practices to your teams. So for example, a pretty common issue that people experience in a university setting is that you've maybe got an advisor and they've got a bunch of students, and these students tend to come and go. In a career sense, they come and go really quickly, right? Because it's 4 or 5 years. And I've worked with actually primarily undergraduate research students, but in some cases, those people have left and a lot of institutional knowledge has gone along with them. I'm guessing a lot of people have seen that. And then the next person coming in is left with a few scratchy notes if they're lucky, and then they just have to figure it out. And so this A-Team Tools repository has some information about retaining some of that value, about passing that on, onboarding new members, checking out the old members. I've had the situation where a lot of institutional knowledge leaves. I've also had the situation where you try to overlap the students by a semester and have them pass on that information. And I've even had the instance where a couple have been really good about documenting what they did and passing it on in a way that somebody else could at least have a fighting chance to pick it up in some future semester. And so this A-Team Tools formalizes that, but those specifics aren't necessarily as important as just the idea that a problem was recognized, people are leaving and their institutional knowledge leaving with it. How can I fix that? And so just adding tools in that way. All right, so here, there's a GitHub organization called Collegeville, which is a board for a team of undergraduate research students, basically. And here is an example. Okay, so we talked about backlog, ready, in progress. In review, effectively, once something's in progress, once the person who's working on it says, I think this is done, then they would move it to in review, at which point a supervisor or some team lead or something would say, yeah, it's done. Move it over to done. The processes here can be very lightweight or heavyweight, depending on what it is. It might be an informal meeting. It could be a product demonstration in front of customers or something to get things moved over to done. Okay, so now moving over to the GitHub side of things a little bit. GitHub supports what I would consider to be basic agile development workflows. There's some major holes in their support for more complicated workflows. I would steer you towards Jira if you want, say, heavyweight support for Scrum or something like that. Some of the things that are really useful, you probably know of @mentions. There is a Kanban board that you can get in GitHub. They call it a project, but then you can piece that together and make it a Kanban board. One of the things that I find most irritating as something that's missing on GitHub is you can't say that this issue depends on this one and have like a formal dependency tree. You can reference an issue within another issue, and it'll provide a link back both ways from those issues, but You can't say this one is dependent on this one, like a one-way directional dependence. Another thing that people get frustrated with sometimes in GitHub that you can do a little bit better in Jira, which is a fairly expensive tool actually, but more advanced notification schemes. Many of you who are on GitHub with active projects may have started filtering your emails or turning off your notifications or something to avoid a deluge of emails. And then another thing that you could get from, say, Jira that you can't get from GitHub is custom fields. Maybe you'd want to define some status of the readiness of the code or something along those lines. You can't add a custom field and then query that through the GitHub API. You can add status flags. You can't add custom fields. We can talk more about that if you're interested. All right. So the way that we have in the past used GitHub to track kind of the higher level activities of a team, not necessarily associated with a project, or not necessarily associated with a specific single code base, is we've created an issues-only repository within GitHub. And so to call this a repository is maybe a little bit of a stretch of what they were intended to do. But this works pretty well overall for tracking the activities of a team, the overall activities. So I would encourage you to go to GitHub. Is everyone on GitHub? Who's not on GitHub? Yeah, good. So you can create a new repository and you can name it issues or something like that, something similar. Often you'd make something like this a private repository. If you're doing this for your own purposes, you might use Trello, like I said, or actually Bitbucket allows you free private repositories for personal work. At least they did last I checked. You can add collaborators, settings and collaborators. I don't know how many of you have set up repositories before. I would encourage you to talk to your neighbor and add them as a collaborator. Get their GitHub ID. All right, are we done now? All right. So then go into the Issues tab and create a new issue. Just type in a title. Maybe you want to do something along the lines of specify project requirements. So I think one place where GitHub is underrated is in general communication that GitHub issues can facilitate. So when I've taught undergraduate software engineering, I've actually encouraged them to not only put in there develop this bit of code, but through the first sprint, I encourage them to put in a bunch of issues associated with basically even figuring out what they're going to do, figuring out how they're going to refine their requirements, put in design discussions into the tickets, and have tickets that are actually focused on design, where the criteria for done for that ticket is to have a design, not just conflate all of those issues associated with implementing something and just having the requirements and design be earlier comments in GitHub. Because when you can break those down into smaller pieces, you can start talking about incremental value. You can talk about, okay, this is done, I've moved it to in review. Now I can get my stakeholders to sign off on the requirements to make sure that we at least seem to be speaking the same language. Now I can get my stakeholders to sign off on the design, not just wait until all of the code implementation is done. It makes it a very explicit and real opportunity to get sign-off incrementally. All right, and then I wanted to show you where to create your Kanban board. So if you go to the Projects tab for your new repository, you can add your Kanban board here. And then you can add customized columns. Another reason to have, just to fill the time as you guys are doing this, another reason to have design discussions within GitHub like that is that previously a lot of these things happened either informally in meetings or got emailed back and forth, in my experience, in design discussions. And there was no readily available artifact associated with that design decision. And oftentimes, 8 years later, I think Anshu talked about this, where you see this code that's just horrifying to look at, and can I just pull that out? Well, you don't know. Well, if you had a design discussion that says, we're going to do this really, really horrifying thing, and we know it's horrifying, but it's our only choice, if you could go back and find some sort of documentation of that decision, that would be useful in those cases. And so then you can click plus by the add cards, and you can drag your issue that you've filed into your backlog column. And it's pretty quick and easy to just populate a Kanban board like this for yourself. I find these to be incredibly useful, say when you go on vacation or you're gone for a weekend. You can sit down and you can just see what your work life was before you left, instead of trying to sift through the last 40 emails that you had and look at what documents are open on your screen and which ones crashed over the weekend and try to remember what was in there. These Kanban boards can be really useful for that. Sometimes when I'm really in an interrupt-driven mode, I'll literally take a small whiteboard with Post-it notes and move those around on there, just to help keep my sanity when I have way too many things going on. Yeah.
Related to that, so yeah, I have a Kanban board like virtual, and then sometimes when I'm just at work and I think of something, I'll just write on a Post-it and make a fake Kanban board right next to me, kind of. What is your workflow in terms of merging those things, so that, for instance, if you were with a group, they would kind of maybe know that you did that stuff? Do you say okay, now that I'm all through all those Post-its, I will type those in and then mark them as done, or
So are you talking about team tasks, or are you talking about just what you are working on personally?
This would be, I guess, both / interpret it as you will.
Yeah, I mean, it can be a little bit, interesting at times, because sometimes you have something on your personal board and you want a coherent set of things that you're doing across all projects, but this one lives on this board and this one lives on this board. What I've done at times is just, file a ticket in the team tracker associated with that team, or if you have a whiteboard or whatever. Do you have a physical whiteboard you use for this team, or do you have a virtual board for the team?
This is virtual.
Okay, and then what I would do is in my personal board, or where I'm trying to keep my own sanity, I would just put a link or a reference to that and update the team visible one and just kind of have a clear placeholder. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but when you sometimes transmit your Kanban board to physical, non-virtual things, do you feel a responsibility to then also translate those into, or do you make sure that anything that you're kind of working on in the moment that maybe written on a Post-it or a whiteboard is already on a different Kanban board, the virtual one? You know what I mean?
Most of the time I use the virtual board. When I go to the physical board, one of two things has usually happened. Usually I kind of fell out of the practice and I'm trying to get back into it, in very concrete ways. Or I've hit one of those moments where I say, this is insane, I have to drop everything. I've got these 3 things, they have to get done before the weekend, or whatever it is. And then I will work those issues on that board kind of independent of my virtual board. This is an overriding emergency board. And then at the end of that, anything that didn't make it to done, I would then transfer back.
Okay, so in terms of like, so this would specifically be tasks that like maybe your team is like not even interested in you completing, and therefore you would not feel like you need to like make a card in the team board and then like move it over.
Yeah, so you're talking about your own, you were talking about your own virtual board and,
Maybe we should talk at another
let's talk
time.
later.
Sorry.
Good idea.
Getting too detailed.
All right, and so throughout this talk, I had to short circuit quite a number of things. If you don't have a background in Scrum, I tried to be explicit enough, but if you need more questions answered about some of my Scrum references, certainly ask me. There's a ton of material about Agile out there and different Agile techniques and approaches. I would caution you against some of the just message board type stuff because there's some misunderstandings about Agile in a lot of those. But you can get to like the Scrum Alliance stuff where you can become certified in being a product owner or a Scrum Master. That has really good information about that. Kanban is a little bit simpler process and tends to be more, I would say, correctly depicted more uniformly on the web. And there's quite a number of resources. All right, those are just extra slides. So do we have any more questions about Agile, GitHub?